Listen to me. I want to start by saying something right from the beginning here because I've been on this bench for a very long time and I've seen a lot of cases come through these doors. I'm talking about decades of experience in this courtroom, and I mean that literally, decades. But every so often, and thankfully not too often, I get a case that just stops me in my tracks. And today is one of those days. I'm looking down at this file here, and I'm reading what you're accused of, and I have to tell you, I've had to take a moment to collect myself. I've had to sit back in my chambers and just think about this, because what I'm seeing on this piece of paper, what I'm reading in this police report, it troubles me deeply. It troubles me in a way that very few cases do anymore. It keeps me up at night, if I'm being completely honest with you. It affects me. It should affect all of us. You are before me today charged with attempting to sexually abuse a minor. That's what it says right here in the complaint. That's what the state of Rhode Island is alleging against you on this date. And I want to be very clear about this from the outset, from the very beginning of our discussion here. This is not a traffic violation. This is not some parking ticket dispute or a registration issue that we're dealing with here. This is not about someone who made a small mistake on the road. This is not about someone who was speeding or failed to signal or had an expired registration or was driving with a suspended license. We are not talking about those kinds of cases today. We are talking about the safety, the dignity, the fundamental well-being of a child. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Do you comprehend the gravity of what we're discussing here today in this courtroom? I need you to understand that this is serious. This is as serious as it gets. Now, I need you to listen to me very carefully because I want to make sure you hear every single word that comes out of my mouth right now. I need you to pay close attention. In all my years on this bench, and there have been many years, I have always believed that everyone who comes before me, everyone without exception, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I have always believed that you have to place yourself in the shoes of the person who stands before you. I have always preached compassion and understanding. I have told countless people in this courtroom that we must look at the circumstances, we must consider the context, we must try to understand what led someone to this moment. I believe in rehabilitation. I believe in second chances. I believe that human beings have the capacity to change and to do better. I truly do believe that, and that's not just words. I've spent my life believing that. But let me be absolutely clear about something, and I need you to hear this very clearly. There is a line. There are certain things that when you cross them, it doesn't matter how much compassion you have in your heart. It doesn't matter how understanding you want to be. It doesn't matter how much you believe in human potential and redemption. You cannot excuse them. You cannot justify them. You cannot rationalize them away. That line exists for a reason, and it's a line that protects children. It's a line that protects the innocent. The protection of children is not negotiable. It is not a matter of perspective. It is not something where reasonable people can disagree about priorities. The safety of our young people is not a matter where we get to exercise discretion in a way that compromises their well-being. When a child comes forward, or when a child is protected because an adult had the moral fortitude to report what they witnessed, we have an obligation. I have an obligation. This entire system has an obligation to that child. That is the foundation of everything we do here. That is what separates a civilized society from something else entirely. That is what we're built on. That is the promise we make to the most vulnerable members of our community. So I'm looking at this file, and I'm seeing the details of the incident. I'm reading what witnesses have reported. I'm seeing what law enforcement has documented. I've read the preliminary investigation materials. I've read the victim impact statement. And what I see is a pattern of behavior that suggests you made deliberate choices. You didn't accidentally find yourself in this situation. You didn't stumble into this by mistake. You didn't wake up one morning and somehow, without any intention, without any plan, end up attempting to abuse a child. That's not what the evidence shows me. From what I'm reading here, this appears to be calculated. This appears to be premeditated. This appears to be someone who sought out an opportunity, who identified a vulnerable individual, a child, and who attempted to exploit that vulnerability for your own gratification. That's what the evidence shows me. That's what concerns me deeply. That's what brings you before this court today. That's the reality of the situation we're facing. Let me ask you something. When you woke up that morning, the morning this happened, did you think to yourself that this was an okay thing to do? Did you have a moment of clarity where you stopped and said, no, this is wrong, I'm not going to do this? Or did you proceed with the assumption that somehow this was acceptable? Did you convince yourself that it was okay? Did you rationalize it in some way that made sense to you? Maybe you told yourself that the child would enjoy it or that it wouldn't hurt them. Maybe you told yourself that this was just exploration, that it was normal, that children weren't really harmed by this kind of thing. Maybe you told yourself that this wouldn't cause any real harm, that the child would forget about it and move on. Maybe you had some other rationalization that made this feel possible in your mind, that made this feel justified to you. because I need to understand from your perspective what was going through your mind when you made this decision. I need to understand how you got to this place where you could contemplate harming a child. I've been a judge for many, many years, and one of the things I've learned is that people who commit terrible crimes often have a way of justifying their behavior to themselves. They have a narrative that makes sense to them. They have reasons, maybe not good reasons, maybe not reasons that would make sense to anyone else, but reasons nonetheless, that explain their actions in their own minds. I've heard those reasons. I've sat and listened to people explain why they did what they did. I've tried to understand their perspective. I've attempted to see through their eyes. And sometimes I can see the human logic, the twisted logic, the flawed reasoning that led them to that place. But here's what I also know, and I want you to hear this very clearly. Understanding those reasons does not excuse the behavior. Understanding what motivated you does not make what you did acceptable. Comprehending the thought process does not reduce the harm. The damage to the child does not diminish because I understand what was in your head. The violation doesn't become less serious because I can trace the path that led you here. Let me tell you something about children. Let me tell you something about what it means to grow up in a world where you should be safe, where you should be protected, where the adults around you are supposed to have your best interests at heart, where you should be able to trust the people in authority. Children are inherently vulnerable. They are still developing, physically and psychologically. They are still learning who they are, what they value, what they believe in. They are still developing their sense of self. They haven't yet built the emotional infrastructure that adults have developed over years and decades, the ability to process trauma, to understand violation, to contextualize betrayal, to integrate experiences of harm into a broader understanding of themselves. When an adult preys on a child, when an adult exploits that vulnerability, when an adult violates that trust that a child has placed in them, they are not just committing a crime. They are damaging a human being in ways that often last a lifetime. They are stealing something that cannot be given back. They are creating scars that run deep, that shape the way that child understands themselves, the way they understand other people, the way they navigate relationships, the way they navigate the world. They are creating trauma that may never fully go away. That is what happens when you hurt a child. I want you to think about that for a moment. I want you to really consider what that means. That child, the child in this case, will never be able to go back to a time before this happened. That child cannot undo this experience. That child will carry this forward whether they want to or not. That child will have to process this, deal with this, understand this as they move through their life. That child will have to figure out what this means about them, what this means about adults, what this means about trust and safety. And that is on you. That is your responsibility. That is the weight of your actions. That is what you have done by making the choices that you made. That is the burden you have placed on someone else who did nothing to deserve it. Now, I also want to acknowledge something because I believe in being honest. I believe that honesty matters in this courtroom. I want to acknowledge that the criminal justice system, the way we handle these cases, it is imperfect. I want to acknowledge that there are people who have found themselves in difficult circumstances, who have struggled with impulses that they shouldn't have acted on, who have had challenging pasts that contributed to their present, who carry trauma of their own. I understand that human behavior is complex. I understand that people are not simply good or evil, right or wrong. I understand that there are layers to this, that there are contexts and histories and complications. But I also understand something else, and this is crucial. Understanding complexity does not mean abandoning accountability. It does not mean ignoring the harm that has been done. Understanding someone's background does not excuse their choices. Acknowledging that someone is a complex human being does not mean that we can overlook what they've done. We cannot let compassion become an excuse for inaction. We cannot use complexity as a shield against responsibility. What I'm trying to say to you is this. I see you as a human being. I'm not sitting here looking at you as some monster, some caricature of evil, some subhuman thing that deserves no consideration whatsoever. You're a person. You have a history. You have circumstances. You have things in your background that may have contributed to who you are today. Perhaps you were abused yourself. Perhaps you have experienced trauma of your own. Perhaps you struggle with impulses or attractions or psychological issues that I cannot fully understand. All of that may be true, and all of that may be part of your story. But the actions you took, the alleged actions that bring you before my bench today, those actions have a victim. That victim is a child, and my obligation first and foremost is to that child, not to you. My obligation is to the child who cannot defend themselves, not to the adult who made conscious choices to cause harm. Let me read you something from the police report. It says here that the child was traumatized by what occurred. The child felt unsafe in their own environment. The child reported feeling confused and frightened. The child felt ashamed, even though they bear absolutely no responsibility for what happened. The child struggled to understand what had happened, to make sense of it. The child had to be interviewed by professionals trained in handling these situations. The child had to go through the process of being examined, of having evidence collected, of being treated like evidence in an investigation. The child had to relive what happened over and over again for different people. The child had to talk to investigators and then to prosecutors, and now has to be prepared for testimony in this courtroom in front of me, in front of you, in front of all these people, and all of that trauma, all of that re-victimization, all of that violation flowed from your choices. Every bit of that pain can be traced back to you and what you decided to do. That is the consequence of your actions. I need you to understand the scope of what you've done here. This is not just about you or the child in isolation. This is about a family that is now dealing with the aftermath of this incident. This is about parents who are struggling to help their child process what happened, who are trying to understand how to support their child through this difficult time. This is about siblings who are worried about their brother or sister, who feel the impact of this trauma in their family. This is about a child who has to go to sleep at night and try to feel safe when they no longer can. This is about the community's ability to protect its most vulnerable members. This is about the fundamental trust that we place in adults to not harm children. When you violate that trust, you don't just violate it for that one child, you compromise it for everyone. You make the world a little less safe. You make parents a little more afraid. You make people question whether they can trust anyone around their children. You contribute to a climate where children cannot simply be children anymore. Now, I want to address something that I think is important. I know that in cases like this, people often want to minimize what happened. They want to say, well, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, or they want to point out that maybe the interaction didn't go as far as it could have gone, or that perhaps the child consented or understood what was happening, or some other rationalization. And yes, I understand intellectually that there are degrees of harm. I understand that these crimes exist on a spectrum. I understand that attempted crimes and completed crimes represent different levels of action and outcome. But let me be very direct with you. Attempting to sexually abuse a minor is a serious, serious offense. The fact that you didn't succeed in completing the act does not make this acceptable. The fact that the child was rescued does not negate what you tried to do. The fact that circumstances prevented the full realization of your intent does not reduce the culpability of your actions. Think about that for a second. You attempted this. You took deliberate steps. You moved toward this action. You put yourself in position to do this. And only through the intervention of someone else, through the vigilance of someone who cared enough to step in, was further harm prevented. That's not a mitigating factor. That's not something that makes this better. That's not something that should make me view this more favorably. If anything, it highlights the fact that you were willing to do this, that you were moving forward with this plan. And it took external intervention to stop you. It took someone else's moral clarity to prevent you from completing an act that you were actively attempting to commit. I've spent my career trying to help people. I've spent my career looking for ways to rehabilitate, to give second chances, to believe in people's capacity to change and do better. That is who I am. That is what I believe in. I've shown leniency to many people. I've given opportunities to many people. I've believed in people when they might not have believed in themselves. But I also believe that there are limits. I believe that there are boundaries. I believe that when someone has taken steps to harm a child, to violate a child's safety and dignity, there is a responsibility to that child that supersedes my desire to be compassionate to you. There is a hierarchy of obligations, and at the top of that hierarchy is the protection of children, always. So let me ask you this. What would you want if this was your child? What would you want the system to do? If someone had approached your child with sexual intent, if someone had tried to exploit your child's vulnerability, if someone had attempted to commit an act of abuse against your child, what would you expect from this courtroom? Would you be satisfied with some rehabilitative program? Would you think that was enough? Would you think that was justice? Or would you want the full weight of justice to come down on that person? Would you want that person to face serious consequences? I think we both know the answer to that question. I think your heart tells you what you would want. And that's exactly what I need to consider here. That's the standard I need to apply. That's the empathy that I need to extend. The reason I ask is because I want you to understand that the child in this case has parents. The child in this case has family members who love them. And those people are sitting in this courtroom right now, having to process the reality that an adult attempted to harm their child. They're here, and they're watching, and they're listening to every word that is said. They're trying to understand how this could happen. They're trying to figure out what to do next. They're trying to help their child heal from this. And their presence in this courtroom is a reminder of what's really at stake here. You know what strikes me most in cases like this? It's the preventability of it all. This didn't have to happen. You didn't have to make these choices. At any point in this process, at any moment where you were contemplating this action, at any point where you were putting yourself in proximity to this child, at any point where you were moving closer to acting on this impulse, you could have stopped. You could have chosen differently. You could have sought help. You could have recognized that what you were thinking about doing was wrong, and you could have walked away. You could have removed yourself from the situation. You could have talked to someone about what you were feeling. You could have gotten therapy. You could have done any number of things, but you didn't. You didn't do any of those things, and that's the most troubling aspect of this from my perspective. That's what troubles me the most about this case. Not that you're a person with problems or challenges or a difficult history. All of that might be true, and all of that might be part of your story. I'm not denying that. But what troubles me is that this was a choice. This was something you chose to do. You made a decision. You exercised agency. You acted. You made choices at multiple points that brought you closer to this crime, and at each of those points, you could have chosen differently, but you didn't. That pattern is what concerns me most. Let me tell you what I've learned from being on this bench for all these years. I've learned that people generally know right from wrong. They understand deep down what is acceptable and what is not. They have an internal compass, a moral sense, even if they don't always acknowledge it or act on it. When someone commits a crime, particularly a crime like this, they are often very aware that what they are doing is wrong. They may not want to admit it, certainly not to themselves. They may construct elaborate justifications for their behavior. They may try to rationalize it in their own minds. They may tell themselves stories about why it's okay, but they know. On some level, they know. And part of what I think needs to happen here is for you to acknowledge that, to stop whatever internal narrative you've constructed about this, to stop whatever rationalizations you've built up, to actually confront the reality of what you attempted to do, to admit to yourself and to this court that you made a choice to cause harm. The criminal justice system has a few purposes as I understand it. One is to punish people who have violated the law. Another is to attempt to rehabilitate them, to try to help them understand what they did wrong and to encourage them to do better in the future. Another is to protect the community from further harm by removing dangerous individuals from society. And another is to give some measure of justice to the victims who have been harmed. In a case like this, all of those purposes matter, all of them are important. But the one that matters most, the one that has to take priority, is the protection of that child and the community more broadly. That has to come first. That has to be the guiding principle. I'm sitting here looking at you, and I'm trying to understand who you are. I'm trying to figure out how a person gets to the point where they would attempt to sexually abuse a minor. I'm trying to understand what happens in someone's life, what choices they make, what rationalizations they construct that leads them to this moment. I'm genuinely trying to understand. But here's the thing, even if I can understand it, even if I can identify with some aspect of your humanity, that does not change my responsibility. My responsibility is to this court, to this system of justice, and most importantly, to the child who was harmed. My responsibility is to make a decision that protects that child and deters others from committing similar acts. The law is very clear about these matters. The punishment for the crime you're accused of is severe, and it is severe for a reason. It is severe because society has determined that the protection of children is paramount. It is severe because we recognize that crimes like this cause profound and lasting damage. It is severe because we want to send a clear message. This behavior will not be tolerated. This will not be accepted. This will result in serious, meaningful, substantial consequences that will impact the rest of your life. I know that you're probably sitting there thinking about what's going to happen to you. You're probably worried about your future, about your freedom, about where you're going to end up. You're probably afraid. I understand that this is frightening for you. I understand that you're experiencing fear and anxiety right now. I'm not without empathy for that experience, but I want to be very clear about something. That concern cannot be primary here. That concern cannot take precedence over the harm that was done to a child. That is not where the priority lies. That is not how I can approach this case. What I need from you, what I need to see before I make any final determination about how this case proceeds, is genuine understanding of what you did. I need to see that you comprehend the harm. I need to see that you recognize the violation that occurred. I need to see that you understand why this matters, why this is serious, why this has consequences. I need to see accountability, real, genuine, deep accountability. If you can demonstrate that, if you can show that you truly understand the gravity of this, that you recognize the harm you caused or attempted to cause, then perhaps there is room for some consideration of mitigating factors. Perhaps we can have a conversation about how we move forward. But if you try to minimize, if you make excuses, then we have a very different conversation ahead of us. This is one of the hard parts of being a judge, because I do believe in compassion, I do believe in redemption, but I also believe that there are crimes so serious, harm so profound, that the obligation to the victim supersedes everything else. A child's safety, dignity, and fundamental right to grow up without exploitation, that is non-negotiable. That line cannot be crossed. So here we are. And I need to know, are you willing to acknowledge the harm and accept responsibility, because those things matter for your future, for this court, and most importantly, for the child who was harmed. This is a serious moment. The decisions made here will have ripple effects far beyond these walls. The child is watching to see if the system will protect them. The family is watching to see if justice will be served. The community is watching to see if we can be trusted. And you are sitting here with the opportunity to begin taking responsibility, showing understanding, and demonstrating that you comprehend the gravity of what you've done. I don't expect that to be easy, but I expect it to be honest and real. I expect you to confront what it means to have attempted to harm a child. Because until you reach that place of genuine understanding, rehabilitation becomes very difficult, real change becomes unlikely, and justice cannot be served. That's where we are. That's what this moment is about. And I'm going to need to hear from you about how you're going to process this, what you're going to do next, and whether you're capable of the accountability this situation demands. That's what we need from you now.